The morning Abraham Alden rode into Caldwell, Kansas with a repossession order tucked in his vest pocket, the last thing he expected to find was a woman loading her entire life into a wagon she no longer legally owned. It was the spring of 1878, and the cattle town of Caldwell sat perched on the southern border of Kansas like a man balanced on the edge of a knife, all dust and ambition, and the particular kind of desperation that settled into a place where people came to start over or to disappear entirely. The Santa Fe Trail had breathed enough life into the town to give it saloons and a general store and a land office and a boarding house where the sheets were changed once a month whether they needed it or not. It had a sheriff named Briggs who was decent enough when sober and a banker named Harlan Potts who was never decent at all. Abraham had been working for Potts for going on 2 years, which was approximately 2 years longer than he'd intended. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, lean in the way that a man gets lean when he doesn't always know where his next meal is coming from, and he had dark eyes that had seen enough of human misery to make them serious, though there was still something underneath the seriousness that hadn't entirely hardened yet. He wasn't proud of the repossession work. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself a lot of things in those days. He rode his bay horse, a gelding he called Copper on account of the reddish sheen to his coat, down the main road of Caldwell and turned onto the side street where the property records indicated one Augusta Sutton, widow, was residing in a small 2-room house with a shed out back and a Studebaker farm wagon that had been purchased on credit from Potts's lending operation 11 months prior. The credit had gone unpaid for 4 months. The bank wanted the wagon back. Abraham had the order. He had done this before. He expected tears, maybe an argument, maybe a door slammed in his face. What he did not expect was what he saw when he rounded the corner of the house and pulled Copper up short. The woman was loading the wagon herself. She was maybe 25 or 26, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical felt hat that had seen better days, and she was carrying a wooden crate that looked like it held every cast iron pot and pan she owned, and she was carrying it with the grim, quiet efficiency of someone who had decided something irrevocable and was seeing it through. She wore a brown work dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and she moved without any of the delicacy that society would have preferred from a woman of her station, which told Abraham that society had not been particularly kind to her, and that she had stopped caring about its preferences. There were other things already loaded in the wagon: a trunk, a small rocking chair that had been tied to the side slat, a flour sack that clinked when the wagon shifted, which meant it had tools in it, a rolled-up canvas that might have been a tent or might have been extra cloth, a rifle, a Winchester, laid along the footboard. The woman set the crate of pots down in the wagon bed with a thud and turned and saw him. She did not startle. That was the first thing Abraham noticed about her. Most people, when a stranger appeared suddenly in their yard, had some kind of visible reaction. Augusta Sutton looked at him with a pair of gray-green eyes that were direct and measuring and entirely unfrightened, and she said, "Can I help you?" Abraham dismounted, because it felt wrong to deliver news like this from the back of a horse to a woman standing in her own yard. He held Copper's reins and took off his hat, which was a habit his mother had drilled into him, and he said, "I'm looking for Augusta Sutton." "You found her," she said, and her voice was steady and her chin was up, and Abraham thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that whatever this woman's circumstances were, they had not managed to defeat her yet. He reached into his vest and produced the repossession order, which was a folded piece of paper with Harlan Potts's signature on it and the seal of the Caldwell lending office, and he held it out. "Ma'am, my name is Abraham Alden. I work for the Potts lending office. I'm here regarding your wagon." She looked at the paper for a moment without taking it. Then she looked at him. "He sent someone to take the wagon." "Yes, ma'am." He couldn't wait 1 more week. Abraham kept his face neutral, which was something he had learned to do in this work, though it cost him more each time. "The order was issued 3 days ago. I was told the account has been in arrears for 4 months. It has, she said, and she didn't deny it, which surprised him, because most people in her situation spent the first 10 minutes of a conversation like this explaining why the debt wasn't really the debt, or why the terms had been misrepresented. She just said it flat and true. It has been. Because my husband died in November and left me with a mortgage on this house and a seed debt to the hardware store and 2 mules that went lame the same week he did, which I've always found to be God's idea of a joke that wasn't funny. She pushed a strand of hair back from her face. I've been managing. I sold the house last week to a man named Devereaux who is moving his family up from Texas. I settled the hardware debt on Tuesday. The wagon payment was the last thing on my list, and I was going to ride out to the bank this afternoon with what I have. Abraham looked at the wagon. He looked at the loaded trunk and the rocking chair and the rolled canvas. He said carefully, "It looks like you're leaving, Mrs. Sutton." "I am leaving," she said. "After I settle the wagon debt. I'm going to Dodge City. My sister is there. She married a dry goods merchant and they have a spare room, and I am going to spend exactly 1 month not being in debt to anyone in Caldwell, Kansas, and then I'm going to figure out the rest of my life. How much do you have?" Abraham asked, and he wasn't sure why he asked it. It wasn't strictly part of his job. She looked at him for a long moment as if she was deciding whether to trust him with that information, and then she said, $42.60. The wagon balance is $48 and some interest. I'm short. Abraham folded the repossession order and put it back in his pocket. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, looking at this woman who had buried her husband and sold her house and settled her debts one by one, and was now standing in her yard with $42.60 and a wagon she'd been loading with her whole life, and something happened in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. "How much interest?" he asked. $4.11, according to the letter Potts sent me, which makes it $52.11 in total, and I have $42.60, which means I am $9.51 short of keeping what is mine. Her voice was still steady, but there was something in the edges of it now, something that told him the steadiness was costing her. Abraham did a thing then that was not in his job description and would certainly not be approved of by Harlan Potts. He reached into his own pocket and counted out $9.60 in coin and held it out to her. Augusta Sutton stared at the money. She stared at it for a long time. Then she looked up at him, and her expression had gone from measured to something more complicated, something that mixed dignity with a reluctant sort of desperation, and something else he couldn't read. "I don't take charity," she said. "I know," he said. "This isn't charity, this is a loan. You can pay me back when you're on your feet in Dodge City." "You don't know me," she said. "You have no reason to believe I'd pay you back. You just paid off a hardware debt on Tuesday," he said, "and you were about to ride to the bank this afternoon. I think you'd pay me back." She looked at the coins in his hand for another long moment. The wind came down the street and lifted a small cloud of dust and moved it across the yard between them. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking. The rocking chair tied to the wagon side shifted slightly with the breeze. Augusta reached out and took the coins. Her fingers were warm against his palm for just a moment, and then the money was hers, and she stepped back and looked at it and said, very quietly, "I will pay you back, Mr. Alden. I'm good for it." "I know you are," he said. She closed her fingers around the coins and looked up at him with those gray-green eyes, and he saw something in them that undid him a little, not gratitude exactly, though there was gratitude in it, but more the look of someone who had been braced so long against the world that a single unexpected kindness had struck them in a place they didn't know was still soft. "I need to finish loading," she said, and she turned toward the house, and Abraham stood there holding Copper's reins and watched her go, and he told himself the feeling in his chest was simply the satisfaction of not having done something terrible today. He was halfway mounted when he heard a sound that stopped him cold. It came from inside the house, not a cry, but something close to it, a quick, sharp intake of breath that a person makes when they are absolutely determined not to cry and are losing the battle. He sat there on copper for a moment, his foot in the stirrup and his weight half committed to the saddle, and he thought about riding away. He thought about it seriously. He was a man with a job to do and no particular invitation to involve himself in this woman's grief. He had already done more than he should have. He dismounted and tied Copper to the fence post. He walked to the door of the house, which was standing open because Augusta had been going in and out, and he knocked on the frame and said, "Mrs. Sutton." A pause. Then her voice completely controlled from somewhere inside. "I'll be out in a moment." "Take your time," he said. He waited on the step. He could see through the open door into the front room of the house, which was nearly empty. There were pale rectangles on the walls where pictures had hung. The floors were swept clean. There was a small table with one chair left beside it, and on the table was a tin cup and a Bible with a worn cover. The room had the particular hollowness of a place that had been lived in and was now being left, and the emptiness of it was not just the absence of furniture, but the absence of the life that furniture had contained. Augusta appeared from the back room. Her eyes were not red. He gave her credit for that. She was carrying a small wooden box, the kind that people kept letters in, and she held it against her chest with both arms like something precious. "My husband's things," she said, though he hadn't asked. "Letters from before we married, a pocket watch that was his father's. I kept them separate so they wouldn't get mixed in with everything else." "That makes sense," Abraham said. She looked around the empty room for a moment. Then she looked at the Bible on the table. "I was going to leave that," she said. "I don't know why I haven't yet." "Because you haven't decided whether to be done being angry at it," Abraham said, and then he was surprised at himself for saying it. Augusta looked at him sharply, and for a moment he thought he had overstepped badly, said exactly the wrong thing to a woman in mourning about her relationship with God. But then something in her face shifted, and she almost smiled. Not a happy smile, but a real one, the kind that acknowledges a truth. "My husband was a decent man," she said, "but he was not a careful one. He borrowed more than he should have, and he planned less than he needed to, and when he died in November of a fever that came on fast and didn't leave, he left me with a tangle I've spent 5 months trying to unknot." She picked up the Bible from the table and tucked it under her arm alongside the wooden box. "And I've unknotted most of it. So I suppose I'm not so angry anymore." "You've done well," Abraham said, and he meant it. "I've done what needed doing," she said, which was, he would come to learn, a very Augusta Sutton answer. She carried the Bible and the box out to the wagon and placed them carefully in the space between the flour sack and the trunk, wedging them in so they wouldn't shift. Abraham watched her do it, and then he said, "Are you driving to Dodge City alone?" She looked at him. "I plan to." "That's 3 days' travel through open country," he said. "There are still bands of Comanche raiders who cut up through the territory this time of year, and road agents near the creek crossings." "I have the Winchester," she said. "Can you shoot it?" "I could hit a man-sized target at 200 yards, she said. "My father believed in practical education." Abraham believed her. He also believed that a lone woman on a loaded wagon in open country between Caldwell and Dodge City was a dangerous thing, regardless of her marksmanship. He stood there with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, and he thought about what he was doing and what he was not doing and what he intended to do next. And then he said, "I'll ride with you." Augusta Sutton looked at him with those direct eyes for a long moment. "Mr. Alden," she said, "you came here this morning to take my wagon." "I know, and now you're offering to escort me to Dodge City." "Yes." "Why?" He thought about it honestly. He said, "Because you deserve to get there without trouble and because I don't have a good reason not to." She considered this. She looked at Copper, who was standing patiently at the fence post. She looked at Abraham, who was standing equally patiently in her yard with his hat in his hands. She said, "I'm leaving at first light tomorrow. I have one more thing to settle in town this afternoon. The house deed needs to be filed at the land office." "I'll be at the edge of town at first light," he said. She nodded once, which was not quite agreement but was not refusal either, and she turned back to the wagon and began making small adjustments to the load, tightening the rope that held the rocking chair, repositioning the flour sack. Abraham untied Copper and mounted and rode back toward the main street of Caldwell, and he did not examine too closely the feeling that had settled in his chest, which was warm and purposeful and more alive than anything he had felt in a considerable stretch of time. He went to the bank first. Harlan Potts was behind his desk in the lending office, a narrow-faced man in his 50s with the kind of eyes that were always calculating something. Abraham laid the repossession order on the desk along with $52.11 in coin, which represented Augusta's $42.60, his own $9.60, and a dime he had rounded up from his boot lining. Potts looked at the money. "You collected the debt." "I collected it," Abraham said. "Every cent." Potts picked up the coins and counted them. He said, "I expected to get the wagon." "The wagon's hers," Abraham said. "The debt is settled. You have your money." Potts gave him a long look that was not entirely friendly. "You're getting soft, Alden." "I'm getting accurate," Abraham said. The order specified the wagon as collateral in the event of non-payment. The payment was received. The collateral returns to the owner. That's how it works. Potts could not argue with the legal logic of it, though Abraham could see he wanted to. He said nothing more, and Abraham walked out of the bank into the spring sunshine of Caldwell, Kansas, and stood on the board sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the smell of dust and horses and wood smoke, and he thought about the fact that he had just spent the last of his savings on a woman he had met 40 minutes ago. He thought about it and found that he did not regret it. That afternoon, he wrote a letter to his younger brother Jesse in St. Joseph, Missouri, telling him nothing of Augusta Sutton, but saying that he was thinking of moving on from Caldwell, and that when he had a new address he would write again. He hadn't known he was thinking of moving on until he wrote it, and once he had written it he understood it was true. He collected his things from the boarding house. He had a saddlebag worth of possessions, which told him something about the last 2 years that he wasn't proud of. A man ought to accumulate more than a saddlebag worth of life in 2 years, even in difficult country. He had a good saddle and copper, and his clothes and his tools, and a photograph of his mother and father taken in 1865, before the war had finished doing its damage to his father, and a small amount of money that was now smaller. He settled his boarding bill, and then he went to the general store and bought supplies for a 3-day trail ride: dried beef, hardtack, coffee, a can of peaches, a tin of tobacco he didn't actually want but that felt like a good thing to have on the trail, and grain for Copper. He ate supper at the saloon's attached dining room, which was called the Meridian and served a passable beef stew, and he sat alone at a corner table and thought about what he was doing. He was leaving a job, such as it was. He was riding 3 days to Dodge City with a widow he didn't know because he didn't want her to come to harm on the road. Those were the facts as he could state them. The other facts: the gray-green eyes, the steadiness of her voice when she talked about her dead husband's debts, the almost smile when he said the thing about the Bible, the brief warmth of her fingers against his palm. Those were not things he was prepared to call facts yet. They were just information. He put them in the back of his mind and drank his coffee and went to bed early. Augusta Sutton did not sleep well. She lay on the floor of the empty house. She had already packed her blankets and her bedroll was in the wagon, on the bare boards with her coat spread under her, staring at the ceiling that had belonged to her and her husband, and now belonged to a man named Devereaux, who was bringing his family up from Texas. And she thought about her husband Thomas, and about the last 5 months, and about the particular exhaustion of grief that is complicated by practical necessity. Because when you have to work every day to survive, you don't have much space to properly mourn, and the grief just follows you around underfoot like a dog that won't be fed. Thomas had been her husband for 3 years. She had been 22 when they married, and he had been 30, and he had been warm and funny and genuinely kind, and not very good with money, which she had known going in and had thought she could manage, and for a while she had managed it. but the mules going lame and the bad harvest of 1877 had put them behind, and then the fever had taken him in November like something efficient and merciless, and without any concern at all for the 3 years they had built together in this house, with its pale wall rectangles where pictures had hung. She missed him. That was the simple truth under all the complicated machinery of settling debts and selling property and making arrangements. She missed him, and she was angry at him, and she was angry at herself for being angry at him because he had not chosen to die, and all of this was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. She thought about the man who had come with the repossession order. Abraham Alden was not what she had expected. She had expected not cruelty exactly, but the particular blankness of a man doing an unpleasant job and not thinking too hard about it. She had not expected someone who took off his hat. She had not expected him to ask how much she was short. She had certainly not expected him to put his hand in his own pocket. She thought about that for a long time. $9.60, which was, she did the arithmetic, most of what a hired hand made in a month. He had handed it to her with no more ceremony than if he were passing the salt at a dinner table, and then called it a loan in a way that made it possible for her to take it. She didn't know what to make of Abraham Alden. She thought that tomorrow, on the road to Dodge City, she might find out. She was at the edge of town before first light, with Copper's hoofbeats still faint in the distance, sitting up on the wagon seat with the reins in her hands, and the Winchester laid across her knees, and the morning star still visible in the western sky. She had harnessed her 2 remaining mules, a pair named Edward and Henry who were elderly but sound, and they stood with the resignation of animals who have made many early departures. The air was cold and smelled of grass and damp earth, and the sky to the east was beginning to show that particular thin gray that precedes the color. She heard Copper's hoofbeats before she saw him, a steady trot in the darkness, and then Abraham materialized out of the early light, his saddlebag behind the saddle and his hat on and his coat collar up against the morning chill, and he pulled up alongside the wagon and looked at her. "You're early," he said. "I am always early," she said. "It's a fault." "It's a virtue," he said, and he fell in alongside the wagon as she released the mule's brake and clicked them forward. They rode in silence for the first mile, which was a comfortable silence, or at least not an uncomfortable one. The light came up slowly around them, turning the Kansas prairie from gray to gold, and the wind was light and the road was relatively good, and Edward and Henry moved at their steady elderly pace without complaint. "You actually came," she said, eventually. "I said I would." "People say things," she said. He was quiet for a moment, considering that. Then he said, "I try not to say things I don't mean. It's inefficient." She glanced at him. "That's an unusual way to put it." "My father was a man who made promises and then had reasons for not keeping them," Abraham said. "Long enough ago that I can say it plainly. It turned me particular about what I say I'll do." Augusta looked at the road ahead. The prairie was opening up around them, vast and gold in the early light, with the grass still pale from winter and just beginning to show the new green at the roots. A red-tailed hawk circled far to the south. The sky was enormous. "What will you do in Dodge City?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "I wrote my brother last night. I may go to St. Joseph, or I may find something in Dodge City." He paused. "I left my job yesterday." She looked at him sharply. "At the bank. I turned in the repossession order and the settled debt and told Potts I was finished," Abraham said. He wasn't surprised. I don't think either of us had expected it to last as long as it did. "Why did it last as long as it did?" He thought about how to answer that. He said, "Because I didn't have a clear idea of what else to do, and an unclear idea of what to do is harder to act on than even a bad, clear idea." She thought about that. "And now you have a clear idea." "I have the beginning of one," he said. She didn't ask him to elaborate, and he didn't offer to. The wagon rolled on through the morning. By midday they had covered 12 miles, and Augusta pulled the mules up at a creek crossing to let them water. The creek was shallow and clear and ran over flat stones, and cottonwood trees lined the bank. their new leaves a pale, shining green against the deep blue of the Kansas sky. Abraham hobbled Copper and let him graze while Augusta climbed down from the wagon with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this all her life. She produced a small tin coffee pot from the wagon box and filled it from upstream of the mules and built a small fire from the dry cottonwood branches that had collected at the bend, and she had coffee going in less time than Abraham could have managed it, which impressed him. "You've traveled before," he said. "We came out from Ohio in 1875, she said, crouching by the fire. "Thomas and I and his brother who went on to Colorado, 3 months on the road. You learned to make coffee fast." She handed him a cup. He took it and hunkered down on the other side of the fire, and they drank coffee in the noon light by the creek while the mules drank and Copper grazed and the cottonwood leaves moved in the soft wind. "What did you do in Ohio?" he asked. "My father was a school teacher," she said. "I taught with him for a year before Thomas and I married. Arithmetic and reading mostly, some geography." She wrapped both hands around her tin cup. "I was good at it. The children were good." A pause. "I've thought about going back to teaching. My sister's town will need a school." "Do you like it, teaching?" She considered the question seriously, which he was already learning she did with all questions. "I like the moment when someone understands something they didn't understand before," she said. "You can see it on their face. It's one of the best things I know of." Abraham thought about that. He said, "I used to want to be a lawyer." She looked at him. "What happened?" "The war happened," he said. "My father came back from it different. My mother needed help with the farm. By the time things settled enough to think about law school, I was 22 and working as a trail hand, and the idea of sitting in a classroom for 3 years seemed like something that belonged to a different life." He paused. "Though I still read law books when I can get them." "You could still do it," she said. "Probably not," he said without bitterness. "But thank you for saying so." She looked at him for a moment over the rim of her cup, and there was something in her expression that was more careful now than it had been that morning, more interested, as if she were revising her understanding of him in some way. "You said this morning that you have the beginning of a clear idea," she said, "about what you want to do." "Yes. What is the rest of it, if you don't mind my asking?" He looked at the fire, which was burning down to coals now that the coffee was made. He said, "I want to stop doing work I'm not proud of. I want to find land somewhere that's more settled than it was, where a man could farm or run cattle without losing everything to drought or raiders or bad luck. I want to build something that means something." He looked up at her. "I haven't had a very good few years, Mrs. Sutton. I've been getting by instead of getting somewhere. I'd like to get somewhere." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I know what that's like." They looked at each other across the dying fire, and the creek ran behind them, and the cottonwood leaves moved in the wind, and the horses grazed in the sunny grass. And between them there was something quiet and serious that was not romantic yet, not exactly, but was the thing that comes before romance in honest people. The recognition of a similar kind of weight being carried, a similar kind of wanting to put it down. They rode until the light began to fail, and made camp on a small rise where they could see the road in both directions. Abraham built the fire, and Augusta cooked the dried beef into a stew with some dried beans she had in the wagon, and it was better than it had any right to be given the ingredients. They sat across from each other in the firelight and ate from tin plates, and Abraham thought that he could not remember the last time a meal had tasted like anything, and he understood that it wasn't the cooking. It was the company. "Tell me about your husband," he said, because he felt it was the right thing to ask and not the wrong thing, and because he sensed that she needed to talk about Thomas more than she needed people not to mention him. She set her fork down on her plate. She looked at the fire. "He laughed easily," she said. "That was the first thing I noticed about him. He found things funny that other men didn't bother to notice. Stupid things, a chicken doing something ridiculous, a dog's expression. He would just laugh out of nowhere. And it was so genuine that you couldn't help laughing with him." She paused. "He was not practical, I knew it. I accepted it. I thought I could make up the difference." She picked up her fork again. "I mostly could, mostly." "He was lucky to have you," Abraham said. "I don't know about that," she said. "I think we were lucky to have each other while we had the time." She looked up at him. "People say to me, 'You're young, you'll marry again,' as if the 3 years didn't amount to anything because they ended. But they did amount to something. They were good years. I am not in a hurry to move past them." "That's a fair thing to say," Abraham said. She looked at him with an expression that was slightly wary, slightly grateful. "Most men find it uncomfortable when a widow talks about her husband." "I'm not most men," he said, and then felt slightly ridiculous for saying it, because it was the kind of thing most men said when they wanted to seem unlike most men. But she didn't roll her eyes. She just nodded once and said, "No, you're not." The second day on the road began with a thin rain that turned the track soft and slowed the mules, and Abraham rode ahead at points to check the condition of the creek crossings, and twice dismounted to help push a wheel free when the wagon bogged in a soft spot. Augusta guided the mules with calm competence, and didn't ask for more help than she needed, and thanked him for what she got without excessive ceremony. They found things to talk about, and things to be quiet about in what seemed like the right proportions for two people who were still learning how the other fit into the world. She told him about her sister Clara in Dodge City, who was practical and cheerful in equal measure, and who had written her a letter every week since Thomas died, which Augusta said was the kind of sister Clara was. She told him about Ohio and the schoolhouse her father taught in, which had been a single room with a stove that smoked, and about the way the prairie had looked to her when they first crossed into Kansas in 1875, so large and so open that she had cried a little, not from fear, but from the sheer extravagance of space. He told her about his brother Jesse, who was the better man of the two of them and who had stayed in St. Joseph and married a girl named Helen and now had 2 children, a boy of 3 and a girl of 1. He told her about driving cattle north from Texas in 1874, which had been brutal and extraordinary in equal measure. He told her about the winter of 1876, which he had spent in a line shack in the Colorado Territory, alone for 3 months with nothing but snow and cattle and a crate of books someone had left in the shack, which was how he had read Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England and understood for the first time what law actually was. "You read Blackstone in a line shack," she said. "Twice," he said. "There wasn't much else to do." She smiled at that, a real smile this time, and it changed her face entirely. It made her look younger and more open, and Abraham held onto the sight of it carefully, the way you hold onto something you understand to be valuable. At noon on the second day, they stopped at a small way station, which was run by an old man named Erasmus Holt, who had a corrugated tin roof over an open yard, a trough for horses, and a reputation for selling cold water and bad coffee, both of which Abraham paid for without complaint. There were 2 other travelers at the station, a freighter heading south with a load of hardware, and a young man who said he was a surveyor working for the railroad, which was pushing new lines west and would change everything about this country within a generation, which was something Abraham thought about with mixed feelings. Erasmus Holt looked at Augusta with the frankness of old men who have decided that social delicacy is for people who have more time left. He said, "Your wife's pretty, son," to Abraham, who opened his mouth to correct him, and then did not correct him, because Augusta caught his eye with a look that said it was not worth the explanation. They rode on in the afternoon rain. Abraham thought about what Erasmus Holt had said. He thought about it more than he probably should have. He thought about the fact that he didn't know this woman well. He had known her for barely 48 hours. She was a widow who was still grieving a man she had loved, and she was going to her sister in Dodge City, and he was going. He still was not entirely sure where he was going. But he thought about her voice when she said, "I like the moment when someone understands something they didn't understand before," and he thought about her hands on the mule reins, easy and sure. And he thought about her almost smile in the empty house and her real smile at noon and the way she had said, I am not in a hurry to move past them. And he thought that she was one of the most honest people he had encountered in a long time, and that honesty was something he had been starving for without knowing it. He said nothing about any of this. It was too soon, and she had made it plain that she was not looking to be moved on from her grief, and he respected that absolutely. But he knew what he was feeling, and he gave it its name privately, and the name was not just admiration or gratitude for good company on a long road. It was the beginning of something more than that. He kept it to himself and rode alongside her wagon through the Kansas rain and was grateful just for this. The road, the woman, the honest conversation, the feeling of going somewhere instead of nowhere. That night they camped in a stand of cottonwoods by a shallow river, and the rain had stopped, and the sky cleared to a black field of stars, so extravagant that Augusta got down from the wagon after supper and stood in the wet grass with her head tipped back, looking at it. "You can't see that in Ohio," she said. "Too many trees." Abraham stood beside her and looked up. The Milky Way was a river of light above them. "Too many clouds in winter," he said, "but in summer it looked like this." "Where did you grow up?" "Indiana," he said. "A farm south of Indianapolis, flat country, big sky." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss it?" "I miss who I was there," he said, "before I knew what I know now." She turned her head and looked at him. Her face was lit by the starlight and the distant glow of the dying campfire, and she looked at him with those gray-green eyes that missed nothing and said, "What do you know now that you'd rather not?" He thought about it. He said, "I know that people make choices for their own reasons and not for yours, and that you can do everything right and things still go wrong, and that the world does not particularly care about you one way or another. I know that." He paused. "But I also know that every once in a while, on a road you didn't expect to be on, something happens that reminds you it isn't all as bleak as you thought. And I've had that happen today, yesterday and today." She looked at him for a long moment. She said softly, "Mr. Alden." "Abraham," he said. Another pause. "Abraham," she said his name like she was testing it. "You should know something about me. Tell me." "I am not a soft woman," she said. "I am not sweet-tempered in the way some women are. I am not gentle with foolishness. I say what I think, and I do not do well with people who are not direct with me. And I am still—" She stopped. Started again. "I am still a woman who had a husband 6 months ago, and that is a real and present thing, not a thing to be managed or stepped over." "I know that," he said. "I am not trying to step over anything." She looked at him. "Then what are you doing?" He considered the question with the honesty it deserved. He said, "I am riding to Dodge City with a woman I admire and telling myself I do not know what comes next, which is probably the most honest thing I can say right now." The silence stretched between them in the starlit dark, full of things unspoken that were not ready to be spoken yet. Then Augusta said, "That is an honest thing to say," and she turned back to look at the stars. They stood beside each other without touching for a long time, looking up at the same sky, and the grass was wet beneath them, and the river ran softly in the dark, and the horses made small sounds in the distance, and it was enough. It was more than enough. On the morning of the third day, they saw Dodge City on the horizon before midday. Dodge City in 1878 was at the height of its cattle season, or would be when the drives came north in summer, and it had the particular electric energy of a place that knew it was important and was not shy about it. Front Street ran along the north side of the Santa Fe Railroad tracks, and there were saloons and dance halls and hotels, and the Dodge House and the Long Branch. And there was also a quieter residential side to the town that often got overlooked in the telling, because the quieter parts of Dodge City were not what made good stories. But the quieter parts were where people like Clara and her dry goods merchant husband Robert Baxter lived, in a decent house with a garden and a milk cow, and the spare room that had been waiting for Augusta for 5 months. Clara Baxter came out of the house the moment she saw the wagon turning onto her street, before it had even fully stopped, and she was running, and she was not someone who ran, being a dignified woman of 28. But she ran now, and she caught Augusta as Augusta was climbing down, and they held each other in the middle of the dusty street for a long time, not saying anything, which was what 5 months of letters and worry and love looked like in person. Abraham stayed on Copper at a respectful distance, holding the mule's lead rope loosely and looking at the middle distance, and he felt something shift in his chest watching the reunion, a kind of warmth that made him think of his brother Jesse and of Jesse's wife Helen, and of the life Jesse had built that was full of people who came running when they saw you. Clara looked up from her sister's shoulder and saw Abraham. She looked at him, then at Augusta, with the swift measuring intelligence of a woman who loves her sister and is taking stock of anyone near her. "Clara," Augusta said, "this is Abraham Alden. He was traveling the same road. He rode with me from Caldwell." "Did he?" Clara said, and her tone was neutral, but her eyes were not neutral at all. "Mr. Alden, will you come in for supper?" "I don't want to impose," Abraham said. "You escorted my sister 3 days from Caldwell without incident," Clara said. "You will come in for supper." He came in for supper. Robert Baxter was a solid, quiet man of 32 who had a firm handshake and a good dry goods operation, and the kind of patient temperament that suited a man who had married into a family of spirited women. He shook Abraham's hand and offered him whiskey, which Abraham declined because he wanted to be clear-headed, and then offered him coffee, which Abraham accepted gratefully. Supper was roast pork and potatoes and bread, and it was the best meal Abraham had eaten in months, and he said so. And Clara accepted the compliment with the composure of a woman who knows she is a good cook and does not need you to tell her. Augusta sat across the table from him and watched him with those measuring eyes, and once she caught him looking at her, and neither of them looked away for a moment too long, and Clara saw it and said nothing, but her expression shifted by a very small degree. After supper, while Clara and Augusta were washing dishes and talking in the low, rapid voices of sisters who have been separated too long, Robert took Abraham out to the front porch and they sat in the evening air, and Robert said without preamble, "Are you planning to stay in Dodge City?" Abraham looked at the street. "I hadn't decided." "There's work," Robert said. "The cattle season will bring opportunity for a man who's willing to work. Beyond that, the town is growing. There's a new school being built. There's a need for men who can be trusted in various capacities." Abraham thought about Augusta teaching in a schoolroom. He thought about what she had said. "I like the moment when someone understands something they didn't understand before." "I'll think on it," he said. Robert Baxter nodded and said nothing more, which Abraham appreciated. They sat in companionable quiet and watched the evening come down over Dodge City, and Abraham thought about clear ideas and the beginnings of them, and about how a thing that started as a road you were traveling could become the place you were meant to arrive. He stayed at the Dodge house that night, and he did not sleep particularly well, not from worry but from the restless energy of a man who is on the edge of something and knows it and does not know what to do with the knowledge. The next morning he went to the land office, not for any specific reason, just to look at what was available, which was a thing a man with a vague idea about land did. There were parcels east of town, not ideal. There was good grass south of the Cimarron, but that was in territory that was still being contested by various parties, and the title situation was complicated. There were 2/4 sections north of town that had changed hands twice and were going relatively cheap for a reason he didn't fully understand, until the land agent explained that the well had gone dry on both, and the previous owners had not been able to afford to dig deeper. Abraham asked how deep the water was. The land agent said probably 60 feet down on the east parcel. Abraham thought about this. He asked if the Cimarron grass issue was likely to be resolved within a year. The land agent said probably yes, given the pace of settlement. He left the land office without buying anything but with more information than he had arrived with. He went to the hardware store and bought a new cinch strap for Copper's saddle. He went to the post office and sent a letter to Jesse in St. Joseph saying he was in Dodge City and thinking about it. He went to the Long Branch Saloon, not to drink, but because the Long Branch had a decent library of old newspapers, and he wanted to read the Kansas newspapers and get a sense of the territory. At noon, he walked to the corner of Front Street and 2nd Avenue and stood in the sun thinking, and then he turned and walked to Clara Baxter's house because he found that was where he wanted to be. Augusta was in the garden when he arrived, which Clara had apparently put her to work in immediately, and she was kneeling in the dirt-turning soil with a small spade, and her hat was pushed back and her sleeves were rolled, and she looked up when she heard his footsteps and said, "You came back." "I said I would look into land this morning," he said. "I did. I also thought I'd see how you were settling in." "I'm settling in," she said, and gestured at the garden with the spade. "Clara doesn't waste time." He crouched down beside the garden bed, not in it, just near. He said, "How did you sleep?" She looked at him with a slightly amused expression. "Is that a polite question or a real one?" "A real one," she considered. "Better than I have in a long time," she said. "There's something about being somewhere safe that you've been working toward for months. The body lets go of something it's been holding." She dug the spade into the earth again. "How about you?" "Not very well," he said honestly. She glanced at him. "Why not?" "Too much to think about." She waited for him to say what he was thinking about, and when he didn't say it immediately she went back to her digging, and he watched her turn the soil in the spring light, and after a while he said, "Augusta." She looked up. He had used her given name for the first time without either of them discussing it, and she noted it. He could see that, but she didn't object. He said, "I'm going to stay in Dodge City for a while and see what I can build here. I think there's something to build. And I want you to know that I am saying this entirely without pressure of any kind and with full understanding of where you are and what you've been through, but I would like to continue knowing you, if you're willing." Augusta Sutton looked at him for a long moment, kneeling in the garden dirt with the small spade in her hand, and her hat pushed back and the spring sun on her face. She looked at him carefully, the way she looked at everything, without sentimentality but also without coldness. "Abraham," she said, and he liked how she said his name, the same way she had under the stars, testing it, making it hers. "I buried my husband 6 months ago. I know. I am not ready to—" She stopped. "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm just asking to be here in Dodge City while you're here, and to see what happens, if anything, in whatever time it takes." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You are a very patient man." "I have not always been," he said, "but I'm finding I can be for the right reason." She looked at him one more time with those gray-green eyes, and then she nodded. And it was not a commitment, and they both knew it, but it was permission, and for now that was enough. He found work within the week. There was a rancher named Cole Stanton who ran cattle north of town and needed a foreman for the summer season. His previous foreman had been offered a position as deputy sheriff and had taken it, which was the kind of unexpected career pivot that was common in Dodge City in 1878. Stanton was a fair man and the work was honest, the kind Abraham had told himself he wanted, and the pay was decent enough that he could save toward land. He began to find his footing in Dodge City. And Augusta found hers. She went to the school board, which was a 3-man committee that met in the back of the hardware store because the new school building was not yet finished, and she presented herself as a candidate for the teaching position. She brought a letter from her father attesting to her education and her years of experience, and she demonstrated her competence in arithmetic and reading to the satisfaction of 2 of the 3 board members. The third, a man named Whitfield, said he was not convinced a widow without local connections was the right choice, at which point Augusta asked him to explain exactly what local connections had to do with the ability to teach arithmetic, and he could not do so. And the other 2 members voted her in. She began teaching in the partially completed school building in May, with the sound of hammering occasionally providing counterpoint to her lessons, which she handled with equanimity. She had 12 students the first week. By the 3rd week she had 17, because word got around about the teacher who was direct and patient and could hold the attention of a roomful of children who had grown up in a cattle town and were correspondingly energetic. Abraham heard about this from Clara, who reported it with the satisfied smile of a sister who was not at all surprised. He and Augusta fell into a rhythm. Sunday dinners at Clara and Robert's house. Tuesday evenings on the porch when the weather was fine and he would come by on his way back from the ranch, still dusty from the day, and she would be sitting with her lesson books, and they would talk until the light was gone. Wednesday afternoons at the general store, where they had developed the habit of running into each other when they were both doing their weekly buying, which had started as genuinely coincidental and had gradually become intentional without either of them formally deciding it had. He learned things about her. She was afraid of nothing he could identify except the thought of losing people she loved, which she said as plainly as she said everything else, one Tuesday evening when he had asked her what she was afraid of. She was deeply loyal and could hold a grudge if she felt she had been genuinely wronged, but she did not hold grudges for small things, and she was quick to forgive honest mistakes. She had a dry sense of humor that emerged in unexpected moments and was funnier for the unexpectedness. She cried at the end of books but not at other people's grief, because when it came to other people's grief she was all practical action. She cooked, she helped, she showed up. She was most herself outdoors in motion, with something useful to do. She learned things about him. He was methodical and patient, and could be stubborn in the way that patient people are stubborn, which was not explosive but was immovable. He had a temper that he kept well in hand, and that very occasionally came out in situations of genuine injustice, which she found, against her expectations, more reassuring than alarming. He was good with animals in the way that people are good with animals when they understand that animals are not decorative but are working partners who deserve respect. He was not a man who said things for effect. Everything he said, he had considered first. She also learned that he was a man who had decided something about her, quietly and without fanfare, and that he was keeping that decision respectfully to himself while she found her footing, and she found this more moving than declarations would have been. June came. The cattle drives arrived from Texas, and Dodge City became the noisy, energetic, slightly dangerous place it was famous for being. Abraham worked long days at the Stanton Ranch, managing the cattle that Stanton was holding for sale to the eastern buyers who came up with the railroad, and came to Tuesday evenings and Sunday dinners dusty and tired but reliably present. One Tuesday evening in late June, Augusta put down her lesson books and looked at him and said, "I went to the land office this week." He looked up. "Oh, I had $20 saved," she said. "Clara and Robert won't take rent. I told them I wouldn't stay without paying something, and Clara told me to save my money, and I told her that made me feel like a charity case, and we argued about it for 20 minutes and I lost, which has never happened to me before, and I don't intend for it to happen again." She said this with the slight exasperation of someone who has been comprehensively outmaneuvered by a person they love. "So I have $20. I looked at what the land office had." "What were you thinking?" he asked carefully. "I was thinking that a schoolteacher's salary, while not extravagant, is enough to live on, and that I do not want to depend on Clara and Robert indefinitely, and that if I could find a small parcel with a house or the materials to build one." She stopped. She looked at him. "But I don't know the territory as well as you do, and you've been at the land office yourself." They looked at each other. "There are 2 quarter sections north of town," Abraham said. "The well has gone dry on both. The first one is the eastern parcel and the water is probably 60 feet down. The price is low." "How low?" "Low enough that between your $20 and what I've saved, and a loan from a bank that is not Harlan Potts, we might be able to buy them both and dig the well and still have enough left for materials." Augusta was quiet for a moment. The sun was going down behind the houses across the street, and the light was golden and long and warm on the porch boards. "We," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Abraham, are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking it carefully," he said, "and with full knowledge of what I said before, that I understand where you are and I am not." "Abraham," she said. He stopped. She said, I'm going to say something that is hard to say, and I'm going to say it plainly because that is how I say things." She looked at her hands for a moment and then back at him. "I have been thinking about you since the morning you came to take my wagon. Not constantly and not in an excessive way, but steadily. The way you think about something that matters." She paused. "I am still a woman who was married and lost her husband, and that does not go away. But I am also a woman who is 26 years old and who has been given a great deal of time in the last 6 months to think about what she wants her life to look like. And the thinking I have done has had you in it." "More and more of it." Abraham said nothing. He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, which was unusual because she could usually read him. She said, "That is me saying that I am not asking to be moved past Thomas or to be moved on too quickly or to do anything at all before it's right. But I am saying that I am not in the same place I was when we rode out of Caldwell, and I think you should know that." "Augusta," he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, something that was below the surface and had been there for a while. "Don't say something just because I said something," she said quickly. "I'm not," he said. "I have been wanting to say this for weeks. I have been keeping it to myself because you asked me to be patient and I meant to be. But since you've said what you said, I'll say this. I love you." He said it simply, without embellishment, the way a man says something he is very sure of. "I love you," not in a passing way, not in a way that started on the road and is looking for the nearest available woman. In a way that is specifically and entirely about you, about who you are and how you think and how you are in the world. "I love you and I want to build something with you if you'll have me. Land and a house and a school and a life. With you." The evening was very quiet. Down the street, somebody's supper fire sent a thin thread of smoke up into the pale sky. Augusta said, very quietly, "That is a lot to say on a Tuesday evening on a porch." "I've been saving it up," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in years, and she put her hand over her mouth as if she hadn't expected it either, and then she looked at him over her fingers with those gray-green eyes full of something that was warm and alive and very much present. "Abraham Alden," she said. "Augusta Sutton," he said. She lowered her hand. "I am going to say yes," she said. "I am going to say yes to the land and the house and the life, but I need a little time to do this properly, to honor what was and move into what could be. Can you give me that?" "I already told you once that I can be patient," he said. "I meant it then and I mean it now." She reached across the space between their chairs and she put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and her hand was warm and real, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that as the sun went down over Dodge City and the summer evening settled around them. They waited 3 more months. It was not a long time in the course of a life, but it was the right time, enough space for Augusta to arrive fully in the present, to feel that she was moving toward something freely and not just away from grief. She continued teaching through the summer term and into the fall, and the school was finished in August and had 3 new students in September. And Augusta stood in the completed building on the first day of the fall term with 20 children arranged in front of her, and felt something settle into place in her that had been displaced for a long time. Abraham bought the East Quarter section in July with the combined savings and a careful loan from a bank in Dodge City, and he and a hired man named Solomon Greer, who was the best well digger in Ford County and knew it, dug down 63 feet and struck water on the 15th day, which was 1 day beyond what Solomon had estimated, and within the budget because Abraham had built in a contingency. The water was clean and cold and ran strong, and Abraham stood at the top of the well shaft with water on his hands and looked at the Kansas sky and felt something he had not felt in years, which was the particular satisfaction of a thing done right with your own hands. He began building the house in August. He was not a carpenter, but he was methodical, and he could follow a plan, and he hired a carpenter named Davis for the framing and the roof, and he did the interior work himself on weekends and evenings. It was a small house, 4 rooms, but it was soundly built and faced east to catch the morning light, which Augusta had mentioned once in passing as something she had always wanted in a house, and Abraham had filed the information away without saying anything about it. He asked her to marry him in September, on a Sunday afternoon on the land, standing in the grass outside the nearly completed house with copper grazing in the distance, and the fall light lying long and gold across the prairie. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a small gold band with a single garnet, which his brother Jesse had sent to him at Abraham's request in a small package that arrived on the Tuesday stage. He said, "I have been building this house with a specific person in mind. I would like that person to come and look at it and tell me what needs to be different, because she will certainly find things. And I would like that person to be my wife, if she will have me." Augusta looked at the house. She looked at the east-facing windows, which caught the morning light in exactly the way she had described wanting once, months ago in conversation, and which told her everything about how carefully he had been listening to her all this time. She looked at him. "There will probably need to be another room eventually," she said, and he understood what she was saying by the way she said it, and something shifted in his face that was more than happiness. "Then I'll build it," he said. "Yes," she said. "Abraham, yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it, the small garnet, and then she put both arms around him and held him, and he held her, and the Kansas wind moved through the long grass around them, and the house stood solidly behind them, and Copper raised his head to look at them, and then went back to grazing with the democratic indifference of a horse who has seen everything. They were married in October of 1878, in a ceremony in Clara Baxter's front parlor, with Clara and Robert as witnesses, and the minister from the Presbyterian Church, and 12 of Augusta's students who had learned about the wedding from somewhere, and appeared at the front gate looking expectant, and were allowed in because Augusta could not turn them away. The minister said the words, and Augusta and Abraham said theirs, and afterward Clara produced a cake that she had been baking in secret for 2 days, and Robert opened a bottle of good whiskey, and the schoolchildren ate cake in the backyard and ran around in the fall sunshine, and it was not a grand wedding, but it was a true one, and truth was what both of them needed. They moved into the house on the east quarter section the following week. It smelled of new wood and clean plaster, and the particular freshness of a space that had never been lived in before, that had no grief in its walls, no disappointment, no old winters. Augusta walked through the 4 rooms with her hand trailing along the walls, and Abraham watched her do it from the doorway of each room in turn. And when she came to the east-facing windows in the main room and the morning light came through them exactly as she had described, she put her hand on the glass and was quiet for a moment. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything you say," he told her. She turned from the window and looked at him across the room, and there was in her face a love so open and unguarded that it almost surprised him, because Augusta Sutton was not in the habit of being unguarded, and the fact that she was here in this room with him told him what she would not have said in words. That winter was a quiet one. They learned to be in the same house together, which is a different thing from knowing someone and a more intimate one. They learned each other's rhythms. Augusta was up before dawn. Abraham was slow in the mornings and fast in the afternoons. She liked silence when she was reading. He could talk through almost anything else but went quiet when he was worried. She cooked better than him, but he was better at the winter preserving, which she found hilarious for reasons she didn't fully explain. They argued twice, both times about practical matters and both times resolved with the directness they both had, because 2 honest people do not carry arguments long. They were happy. It was not the breathless happiness of fairy stories, but the real happiness that is built out of good days and honest words, and the feeling of waking up every morning next to someone whose presence makes the day seem possible. In the spring of 1879, Abraham went back to the land office and inquired about the second quarter section, the western one, adjacent to his east parcel. The price had dropped slightly because the dry well situation had discouraged further interest. He bought it with the winter's savings, and Solomon Greer came back and dug a second well on the western parcel and struck water at 57 feet, which was better than before, and Abraham began to think about cattle. Cole Stanton, the rancher he had worked for the summer before, was looking to scale back his operation. He sold Abraham 20 head of cattle at a fair price, and Abraham ran them on the western parcel through the summer and fall of 1879, and they did well enough that he added 10 more in the spring of 1880. Augusta taught every school term. She was, by all accounts, the best teacher Dodge City had had, which she knew because the school board told her, and because parents told her, and because she could see it in the children, which was the only evidence that actually mattered to her. She had 23 students in the fall of 1879, and 2 of them, a pair of brothers named Eli and Sam Greenfield, came from a family that had recently arrived from Virginia, recently freed, making their way west as so many black families were doing in those years, pursuing the possibility of land and lives that the East had denied them. Augusta treated Eli and Sam with exactly the same attention and expectation she gave every other student, which was not something everyone in Dodge City agreed with, and which she communicated to the school board with a clarity that left no room for argument. The Greenfield boys were 2 of her best students. Sam Greenfield would later, in another story and another time, become a lawyer in Wichita, but that is beyond the frame of this story. The point is that Augusta saw what was right and did it, and Abraham loved her for it without qualification. In October of 1879, Augusta told Abraham that the room they had discussed in the grass that September afternoon on the day he proposed was going to be needed. He stood in the kitchen when she told him, holding his coffee cup, and the expression that crossed his face was one that she kept in her memory for the rest of her life, pure and uncomplicated joy, arriving on the face of a man who had grown unaccustomed to uncomplicated joy and was receiving it almost shyly. "Augusta," he said. "Stop looking like that," she said, smiling at him. "You'll make me cry, and I don't cry." "You cry at the end of books," he said. "That is entirely different," she said, and she was laughing. He built the room that fall and had it finished by December, which was cutting it close because the baby came in April. The room was on the north side of the house, which was a quiet side, and he put a window in it that looked out over the pasture where the cattle grazed, so the baby could watch them one day. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas Abraham Alden, which was a decision Augusta made quietly and told Abraham on an evening when the baby was a week old, and Abraham had not said anything for a long moment and then had said, "That's a good name," and she had looked at him and understood that she had married someone who did not have a small heart. Thomas was a healthy child, loud and decided in his opinions from very early on, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He had Augusta's gray-green eyes and Abraham's dark hair, and a disposition that was all his own, which was sunny and curious and not very patient, which also surprised no one. Abraham wrote to Jesse and sent Joseph, and Jesse wrote back that he was bringing Helen and the children out to see the new baby in the summer, which was a plan that thrilled Abraham in a way he hadn't expected, the prospect of his brother in his house, on his land, seeing what he had built. Jesse came in June of 1880 with Helen and the boy William and the little girl Sarah, and they stayed a week, and the house was full of children and conversation, and the smell of Clara's cooking, because Clara and Robert came to dinner twice, and Abraham sat on the porch in the June evenings with his brother and told him things he had not told anyone else. About the last bad years, and about the morning he rode into Caldwell, and about the woman loading the wagon and the coin he had put into his own pocket, and the feeling in his chest when their hands had touched. Jesse listened to all of it with the patient smile of a man who has been waiting for his older brother to find his footing. He said, "I knew you'd get here eventually." "I didn't," Abraham said. "No," Jesse said, "but I did." They sat in the quiet, the two brothers, while the summer light went down over the Kansas prairie. And in the house behind them, Augusta and Helen were talking, and Thomas was making the particular sounds of a baby who has been fed and is satisfied with the world. And the cattle moved in the pasture, and the well ran clean and cold, and the house stood solid against the dark. Time moved in the way that good time moves, not too quickly, not without its share of difficulty, but steadily forward. The cattle operation grew. By 1881, Abraham had 60 head and had hired Solomon Greer's son Marcus as a hand. And Marcus was good with cattle and better with horses, and grew into the kind of right-hand man that a small ranching operation depended on. Abraham was direct with Marcus and paid him fairly, and Marcus, who had grown up in a world where fair payment from white employers was not something that could be assumed, noted this and stayed, and the trust between them was mutual and real. Augusta taught through 1880 and 1881 and into 1882, and in the spring of 1882, when she was expecting their second child, she took the fall term off and handed her classroom to a young woman named Eliza Parks, who had come to Dodge City from Missouri and was a natural teacher. Augusta did not intend to be away long. She came back in January of 1883 with the baby in arms, a girl this time, born in October of 1882, with Abraham's dark eyes and Augusta's determination visible already in the set of her small jaw. And she taught with the baby in a basket beside her desk until the spring, which the school board took objection to, until Augusta asked them which of them would prefer to bring the infant, and the conversation ended there. They named the girl Ruth Abraham Alden. Ruth for the biblical quality of loyalty that Augusta had always admired. Abraham for Abraham's mother, who had kept the farm running when his father came back from the war changed, and who had never, as far as Abraham knew, failed at a single practical task in her life. Ruth was, from very early, her mother's daughter in temperament and her father's daughter in stubbornness, which made her, by the age of 2, a force of nature in the small house on the East Quarter section of Dodge City, Kansas. In the summer of 1883, Harlan Potts came to Dodge City. Abraham learned of it from Robert Baxter, who had heard it at the dry goods counter from a man who had driven up from Caldwell. Potts was looking to expand his lending operation north, following the trail of settlement money. He had evidently heard that there was a man in Dodge City who had a small but growing cattle operation and good land, and might be in a position to need capital. Abraham was not in a position to need Harlan Potts's capital. He was doing fine without it. But he was also aware that Potts was the kind of man who created the need for capital by other means if the natural need did not present itself. He thought about this for a day and then went to see the lawyer in town, a man named William Hartwell, who had an office above the pharmacy and who was, by Dodge City standards, excellent. Abraham sat down with Hartwell and explained the situation, the history with Potts, the circumstances of his employment, the terms of Augusta's original debt and how it had been settled, and asked Hartwell to look at his deed and title documents and tell him if everything was in order. Hartwell looked. Everything was in order. The deeds were clean, the titles clear, the water rights properly recorded. Hartwell said, "If Potts comes at you, he has nothing to come at." "I know," Abraham said. "But I wanted to be certain." He also went to see Cole Stanton, who was now mostly retired but still had the ear of every significant cattleman in Ford County, and he told Stanton about Potts coming north and what he knew of Potts's methods. Stanton said he would spread the word. Small towns ran on information, and the best protection against a predatory lender was a community that knew what he was. Potts came to Dodge City and stayed 3 weeks and found it unreceptive territory and went back to Caldwell. Abraham heard this from Robert Baxter, who had heard it from Hartwell, and he told Augusta at dinner that evening while Thomas ate his potatoes with one hand and used the other to try to feed Ruth, who was refusing to cooperate. "Good," Augusta said. "Good," Abraham agreed. "Will he come back?" "I don't think so," Abraham said. "He doesn't like uncooperative markets." He paused. I also think he remembers that I settled your debt in full and he got his money and has no legitimate claim to anything in this household, and that's not the kind of territory he works in." Augusta looked at him across the table, over the heads of their children. She said, "You settled my debt in full." "The debt was settled," he said. She looked at him with that expression he had seen under the stars by the river on the second night, the expression that meant she was revising her understanding of something. "You paid the rest yourself," she said. "You told me it was a loan." "It was a loan," he said. "Abraham," her voice had changed. That was your savings." "Some of them," he said. "And you paid me back. In June through the mail before we were married. Don't you remember?" She stared at him. "That was $20 I sent to your general delivery in Dodge City. I told myself you'd get it. I didn't know if I didn't know if it had found you." "It found me," he said, "the same week I arrived. You never said anything. You'd moved on to other things by then," he said. It seemed beside the point. She looked at him for a long time, and Thomas said something incomprehensible and Ruth threw a potato. And Augusta did not take her eyes from her husband, and there was in her face something that was not quite tears. She didn't cry, she had said so. She was consistent about it, but was the equivalent of tears in a woman who had decided long ago that what she felt would express itself in other ways. "I love you," she said, directly, without preamble, the way she did everything. "I know," he said. "I love you too." Thomas, who was 3.5 and observant, said, "Mama loves Papa," with the satisfied tone of someone reporting a fact. And Ruth, who was 9 months old, said something that was not a word yet but had the energy of agreement. Abraham laughed and Augusta laughed, and the potatoes went cold and the evening went on, warm and full and ordinary and extraordinary in the way that good evenings in a good life are. In 1884, they dug a third well and Abraham bought another 40 head and hired a second hand and began to think. Not urgently, but with the steady horizon-watching quality of his thinking, about the future of the operation. Jessie came again that summer, without the children this time because William was old enough to stay with Helen's parents, and the two brothers rode the property together, and Jessie, who had done well with a hardware business in St. Joseph, asked Abraham careful questions about the land and the water and the market. By the time Jessie left, they had the beginning of an agreement, not a formal one yet, just the discussion between two brothers about what might be possible, about whether a partnership made sense, about whether Jessie might consider coming west. Augusta heard about this conversation that evening and said, "You want your brother here?" "Yes," Abraham said. "Then let's make it happen," she said. "What do we need to do?" He looked at her across the kitchen, where she was mixing biscuit dough with the efficient movements of a woman who had long ago made her peace with domestic labor as something that coexisted with everything else she was. And he thought about the morning in Caldwell when she had turned from the wagon and looked at him with those direct, unfrightened eyes and said, "Can I help you?" And how he had not known then what was in front of him, and how grateful he was for the not knowing, because if he had known, he might have been frightened of it. He thought about how she had said, "I'm not a soft woman," under the stars, and he thought about how true that was and how it was exactly what he had needed and hadn't known he needed, because the last thing he had wanted was someone whose edges bent when the world pressed. He had wanted someone who stood firm and was real and said true things, and that was what he had, and he knew it every day. He also thought, privately, about that moment when he had unloaded her wagon. He thought about it sometimes, when he needed to remember how close he had come to missing it. He had not literally unloaded it, but he had come to take it and found her loading it and had instead done the opposite of taking, had handed her the difference, had said in effect by everything he did after that, "You are not going anywhere without me, at least not if I can help it, and I would very much like to help it." She had said later, months later, in their house, in winter, "When you rode up that morning, I was so angry." He had asked her what she meant, and she had said, "Not at you, not really, at everything, at the situation, at the timing." I had everything in that wagon, and I was going to Dodge City, and I was going to start over, and I thought, of course, there is one more obstacle." She had paused. "And then you took off your hat. That's what changed it," he asked. "That and you asking how much I was short," she said. "Because most men who come to take something don't ask how much you need to keep it." "I should have done more," he said. "No," she said firmly. "You did exactly the right amount in exactly the right way. If you had done more, I would have thought you were after something. What you did was calibrated. It was honest." He thought about this. He said, "I was after something." She raised an eyebrow. "What?" "To not do a thing I was ashamed of," he said. "I've been doing things I was ashamed of for 2 years, and I wanted one morning when I did the decent thing and let it stand." She had looked at him with the full weight of those gray-green eyes and said, "And what you got was me." "What I got was you," he agreed. "Do you regret it?" she asked, with the smallest edge of humor that meant she knew the answer. "Every single day," he said, and she threw a dish towel at him and he caught it. And that was what they were like in the house together, in the space between the seriousness and the love and the children and the work. Jesse and Helen came to Dodge City in the spring of 1885, permanently, with William, who was now 7, and Sarah, who was 4, and a new baby named Abraham, which Jesse said was after their father and not after his brother, which was what he said, and which no one believed. Abraham found them a house in town, while Jesse's part of the land partnership was being formalized. And within the year, Jesse had a small hardware operation running out of a leased building on Main Street, and was supplying the ranching community and the residential community, and doing well by any measure. Dodge City had changed since 1878. The wildest of the cattle season violence was passing as the town grew more settled and the law put down deeper roots. Wyatt Earp had come and gone. Bat Masterson had been the sheriff and had brought a certain order to Front Street that the town had needed. The Santa Fe Railroad had made the town a genuine commercial hub. There were churches and a school and a reading room at the library that Augusta helped organize, and there were still saloons and gamblers and the occasional Saturday night disruption. But the balance had shifted toward permanence, toward the kind of place people raised children in, which was a different kind of place than the kind you passed through. Augusta stood at her schoolroom window one October morning in 1885 and looked at the town that had become hers, at the Main Street, and the houses spreading out on the residential blocks, and the land beyond the town stretching toward the horizon under a blue sky that was so large and clear it still, after 7 years, made her feel the particular emotion she had felt the first time she came to Kansas, the one that was too big to be just beauty and too specific to be just awe. Thomas was 5 now and in school, not hers because she had long ago made the decision not to teach her own children on principle, but in the class of Eliza Parks, who was now the school's second teacher and who was excellent. Ruth was 3 and was at home with the woman who came in 3 mornings a week to help, and Augusta was expecting again, a fact she had told Abraham last week in the kitchen in the morning before either of the children were up, and he had stood very still and then crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and said nothing, which was more than anything he could have said. The 3rd child would come in March. They did not know yet if it would be a boy or a girl. Abraham had said boy and Augusta had said she thought girl, and they had agreed that either way the name would need to be decided with more time than Thomas had gotten, since Thomas's name had been decided in one emotional evening, and Ruth's had been decided in a discussion that had taken 2 weeks and covered 6 different options. They had more time now. They had built a life that had room in it, room for discussion, and for the slow working out of things, for Sunday dinners that were large and loud now that Jesse and Helen were in town, for Tuesday evenings on the porch that had never quite stopped even when the Tuesday errand tradition had been absorbed into the rhythms of a shared house, for the ordinary, unremarkable miracle of going to sleep beside someone you love and waking up next to them and beginning again. Abraham had never become a lawyer. He had stopped thinking of it as something he'd missed and started thinking of it as the thing that had made room for something else, which he thought was probably the mature way to consider an abandoned ambition. He had his land and his cattle and his brother and his children and his wife, and on the shelf above the desk in the small room he used for accounts there was Blackstone's Commentaries, which he read some evenings still, not with any practical aim but because it pleased him, and because in the lined shack in Colorado in the winter of 1876 it had been the thing that kept him company, and he kept it for that reason. Augusta found it there one winter evening when she came in looking for the ledger and saw it on the shelf, and she said, "You kept it." "I always intended to," he said. She took it down and looked at the worn spine and the penciled notes in the margins that were his, the younger self of him trying to understand a world he had wanted to be part of, and she put it back carefully and said, "You're a good man, Abraham Alden." "I try to be," he said. "You are," she said, with the flat certainty she gave to things she had thought through and decided. "Don't be modest about it. Being a good man is not a small thing. I've known men who weren't, and I know what the difference is." He looked at her in the lamplight, his wife of 7 years, still with those direct gray-green eyes and the habit of saying the true thing, still with the edge of humor in everything serious and the seriousness in everything funny, still the woman who had been loading that wagon with the efficiency of someone who had decided something irrevocable and was seeing it through. She was 29 and he was 35, and Thomas was 5 and Ruth was 3, and the baby was coming in March, and the land was good and the water was clean and the house was warm. He said, "Augusta." "Abraham," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for taking the money." She looked at him, startled by the direction of it, and then she understood. She said, "Thank you for offering it." He held out his hand across the desk, and she put hers in it, and they sat like that in the lamplight of the accounting room, in the house that faced east to catch the morning, while outside the Kansas night was cold and full of stars, and the cattle stood in the pasture, and the well ran deep and clean, and their children slept in the rooms above. "I was so sure I was going," she said quietly after a while. "That morning, I had everything in that wagon and I was going, and nothing was going to stop me." "I know," he said. "I could see it." "And then you came and told me you were there to take it," she said, "and I thought, well, of course this is how it ends." She shook her head slightly. "But it wasn't how it ended." "No," he said. "It was how it started," she said. He held her hand in the warm lamplight. The night was quiet around the house. The baby was coming in March. The land was theirs. They had made it to where they were going, though neither of them had known that first morning, in the dusty yard in Caldwell with the wagon between them, that they were going anywhere together at all. Outside, the stars came out over the Kansas prairie, the same stars they had stood under on the second night of the road to Dodge City, before anything was declared or decided. The same extravagant black sky, the same enormous silence. And in the warm house under that sky, Augusta Sutton Alden looked at the man who had come to take her wagon and instead had given her the rest of her life, and she was, for the first time since November of 1877, without a single thing that needed to be managed or unknotted or endured. She was only here, only now, only this. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.